Hello, I'm Emma Desi, and welcome to another episode of Turning Readers into Writers. If you're brand new here, welcome, and here's what you need to know. This is a community that believes you are never too old to write your first novel. No matter what you've been up to until now, if you're ready to write your book, I'm ready to help you reach the end. I focus on helping you find the time and confidence to begin your writing journey, as well as the craft and skills you need to finish the book. Each week I interview debut authors, editors and industry experts to keep you motivated, inspired and educated on all things writing, editing and publishing. If you want to catch up, head on over to emmadesi.com where you'll find a wealth of information and tools to help you get started. Before we dive in, this week's episode is brought to you by my free cheat sheet, 30 Top Tips to Find Time to Write. In this guide, I give you 30 ways that you can find time to write in the small gaps that appear between the various errands and tasks and responsibilities that you have in your day-to-day life. Now, you might be thinking that you don't have any time to spare, but I can guarantee these top tips will give you writing time you didn't think you had. If you thought writing always involved a pen and paper or a keyboard, think again. If you thought you needed at least an hour at a time to write your manuscript, I help you reframe that. You won't be disappointed. Get your free copy of 30 Top Tips to Find Time to Write by going to emmadesi.com/30 Top Tips. Okay, let's dive in to today's episode. Welcome back to Turning Readers into Writers, and we are continuing with the Author Accelerator series. And this is a corker. This is a really great one. This is with Emily Thompson. She is a steampunk writer, and she's written a series of 12 books. And in today's episode, she takes you through the steps that she uses to write her series. From beginning to end. So, when you've got that initial idea right through to the completed series being written, all the things you need to think about, the order in which she recommends that you do things to keep life as simple as possible or as simple as it can be while writing a book and indeed writing a series of books. I had forgotten just how good this session is. She does use slides in this, and if you want to go to the show notes, you will find a link to the slides in the show notes there. So if you want to kind of go back and get a refresher on anything, you can do that via the slides that she's provided that are on her blog. So you'll find that. Again, I've listed all of that in the show notes. So I will stop talking and I will let Emily take over, and I promise you will get a lot from this episode today. Emily Thompson is an author and an artist. She's originally from Northern California, and although she adores steampunk and all things Victoriana, she also writes sci-fi, fantasy, and young adult. After studying film and animation at university, she changed to a Japanese language focus and studied abroad in Tokyo for a year. Lucky thing. She received a degree in Japanese and later spent another 2 years in Japan teaching English and writing. She now lives in Washington and spends most of her time writing in coffee shops, painting, and playing far too many video games. So welcome, Emily.
Hey, thank you.
Now, you mentioned it's mentioned in your intro there that you normally like to write in coffee shops, much like myself, actually. So how have you been coping with lockdown? And although things are easing slightly, it's still a serious situation.
Yeah, it's been kind of tough, honestly, on my brain, because when I'm home, it's like I've got all these distractions. I've got books I want to read. I've got games to play. It's a whole thing. So I've honestly, my little workstation where I do most of my computing, I've really upped it. I've now got a collection of nice candles. I listen to a lot of Chilled Cow on YouTube. I got a little plant. I try to make it like fancy spot-y where I'm looking. That seems to help.
Yeah, make a nice space to be. I don't blame you.
And I'm also scheduling time. I don't usually do that. I don't usually like force myself like, okay, I have to write 3 hours today. But I'm more so sort of saying, okay, brain, if you want to write Thursdays and Saturdays, you don't have to work. So we're just gonna write those days. And that seems to help sort of having a schedule of at least a whole day when I can be like, well, maybe I should play games today. Maybe I'll write a little, you know. It seems to help.
Yeah, I'm a big believer in scheduling. It's something I always encourage
Mm,
people to do. I kind of think, well, certainly for me, I think other people are fairly similar, that if it's not in the diary, it's very
mhm.
unlikely to happen. So I think
Yeah.
particularly when you're a new writer and you're transitioning into writing more regularly, scheduling your time, I'm a big believer in. Even if
Hmm.
it's 20 minutes, get it in the
Yep.
diary. So would you tell us a little bit about your books and the series that you write?
Right. Well, most recently I've published I'm about to complete my 12 novel series. The last book, I finished the cover. I'm working on formatting right now because everything I do is independent. So it should be available for pre-order by the end of the month.
Wow.
I'm hoping my goal is September 1st because it will be released on November 17th.
That's so exciting.
Yeah.
Congratulations.
Yeah, it's really fun. It's kind of weird though, because it almost feels like a breakup because it's the last thing I'm gonna do with these
Will it
characters.
be the last one, do you think? Or are you tempted? Are you tempted to go
I'm
further?
very, very tempted to do some more, but I have some ideas for spin-offs. But basically it's a steampunk adventure series about a clockmaker who at first doesn't want to leave the house. He just stays at home. He fixes his clocks and he doesn't talk to people. He has very good reasons for this, but he ends up getting on a big adventure that takes him all around the world. He crosses the world like 15 times in the series. Ends up with airship pirates. He saves a princess. It's a whole thing.
I love it. It's a good
Yeah.
adventure. So 12 books, that's pretty impressive.
Yes.
So
Mm.
you know then about how to put all these stories together so that you have some nice satisfactory endings in one book, but we continue the journey on.
So to start off, step one, most important thing to start with is you got to decide on a very small idea before you get into a very big idea. So, for example, you want to like condense down things like if you think of Harry Potter, it's really just about the boy who lived taking down the Dark Lord. And if you watch Supernatural, that's really just a show about two brothers and how they relate to each other. Lost was about unraveling a mystery. Star Wars about a boy becoming a man. A lot of stories are like that. And so for my personal story, for my series, I decided that Twist, who's the main character of my series, was going to become a person. Well, he was a person who was incapable of love at the beginning. He was very isolated. He couldn't make friends. He couldn't make connections. And I wanted him to become the opposite of that by the end. So a very, very small idea should be the start. And you need to remember what this is throughout the process. So write it down, put it at the top of your journal, whatever works for you. But it's very important to know what that initial core idea is. And then once you have that initial core idea, you can move on to the second one, which is you need to play with these ideas. You need to play with these characters, come up with all of the settings, or not all of them, but like a general idea of what kind of setting you want. Do you want space stations? Do you want, Victorian England? Do you want modern day? What kind of world are you playing in? What kind of magic are you using? What kind of technology? Is it no magic? All of those sorts of decisions you need to make at this point. So just sort of what I usually do with when I'm doing this is I just sort of let my brain go and do whatever sounds like fun and just play with those ideas. And then later you can sort of specialize what you're dealing with, but just play, just throw things at the wall and try all kinds of stuff. Write little scenes with your characters. Try like testing out some interactions with them, maybe put them in weird situations. Like I've even when I was unsure about some characters, I wrote a little draft short story of them just going to have coffee and talking for a while that never showed up in the book. I just wanted to get an idea who I was dealing with. So basically just figure out what your general world is going to feel like and who you're going to be having. And for me, when I wrote my Twist series, I actually wrote the entire first book pretty much before I even decided, okay, that's it. This is going to be a series. So if you have a book completed and you're like, can I stretch this? That's a perfect place to start. So for three, though, now three is a very, very important idea. I would say this is probably the most important excuse me, especially if you're dealing with a mystery sort of series, you need to decide what kind of ending you're going to have. Are you going to have an ending, or are you going to try to keep it going forever? Because those are very different structures. So it can be a simple idea. It doesn't have to be really detailed. For example, Harry Potter and Star Wars, it was probably just the idea, well, they'll win in the end when the writers were first working on these. For me, I knew that with Twist, I wanted him to be completely transformed. So going from being really isolated and alone to having family and friends and people he cared about all over him. So I knew that was where I was going. It's very important to know where you're going when you're doing a series. So the danger of a no ending idea, which is that's sort of what a lot of television shows follow, is we'll just keep this going as long as they keep paying us kind of idea, which is also fine. Like, I think the Harry Dresden books have a tendency to have no ending ideas. But the problem with that is if you do ever stop, it's going to feel unsatisfying if you're not building to something. And that's really the danger of not coming up with your ending first. So, for example, if any of you watched Lost when it was on TV, if you're binging it now, that did not end well. That sort of fizzled and got weird and esoteric way fast. And it was very obvious to me watching the show that they did not have an ending in mind at the beginning. So for me, I find if you're going to write a series, it's really important to know at least vaguely where you're going. And so I'd say that's probably like the second most important thing. So the next thing is, once you've got a basic idea, you know sort of what your characters are like, sort of what your world's like, you've got some kind of ending in mind. The next thing is to decide on a general length. Now, this is flexible, though. You don't have to necessarily like stick to a real strict regimen, but give yourself an idea of what you want, like how many books you want to write, how long you want the series to go. So yeah, this is going to totally change as you're working. But the thing is, you need to have some idea so that you can start building your arcs. So for me, I chose 12, partially because I wanted room to run. I knew that I had, when I wrote my first book, I realized, okay, there's a lot I can do with this. These characters, I started them really, really minimal. Like there was a lot of room for growth for them. They had a lot of flaws. I'm like, I can spend some time with these guys. I can definitely make this run for a while. And I decided on 12 kind of arbitrarily, simply because I knew myself, I knew I'm long-winded, and I knew, okay, well, there's 12 numbers on a clock face, and this is all about clockwork. So what the heck? Let's go for 12 and see what happens. But right now, I've moved on from writing my long series, and I'm now working on a new series. And I originally was thinking, okay, let's not go crazy again. Let's do 3 this time. A trilogy is a nice number. Let's write 3 books. But right now, I've just finished writing the second book in that new series, and I'm starting to feel like I need more room. I have my arcs are getting cramped at the end, so I'm like, okay, maybe I'm gonna have to push this guy out to 4. So it's perfectly okay to change your idea mid-run, but it's a good idea when you start to have some idea what you want, what you're getting yourself into. And also, very important at this point to, like I said, I know myself. I know I'm pretty long-winded. I have no problem going on and on and on. But if you struggle with that, I would not try to do a long series. I'd try with 3, try 2. Just start small until you realize where you like to be. Because if you struggle to get the series finished, if you struggle to do that, it's going to show up in the writing. It's gonna not be as much fun for the reader to read. There's some details you're not going to be able to smooth out. So it's a good idea to sort of listen to yourself and know, like, look at your past projects and what you've done before, and just sort of try to gauge by that as well. Okay, so now, excuse me, now you've got a basic idea, you've got at least some writing done, you've decided on an ending, and you've got your length. Now it's time to build that central thread. So the central arc, that is the basic storyline of the main character usually. So it's taking your character from his beginning or her beginning to their end. So figure out basically the shape of what you want to happen there. Do you want them, how many times do you want them to fail? What kind of growth are you looking for? Is it only interpersonal growth? Do you want them to take over the world? You know, that kind of stuff. So, one thing that really helped though is to look at other stories that are like yours, that are like the one you're writing. And it's totally fine to steal. Absolutely. Just steal away. Because at this level, what you're doing, it's so structural that you're going to put so many details on top that it's totally fine to steal a complete arc from another, like, even well-known series. Because honestly, if any of you know a lot about like story arcs and act structure and things like that, there's like something like 8 stories in the world, and they just keep getting repeated. So it's perfectly fine. So yeah, so you can follow an act structure. You can, there's many different kinds. I would look to film criticism to really like look at people who know a lot about structuring the story, because for some reason, the people who talk about film, for me personally, I find it much easier to understand what they're talking about than people who talk about literature. So definitely, like, YouTube's a great resource. There's a lot of film critics out there that are very intelligent and very detailed in the way that they pick stories apart, and they'll explain to you how story arcs work, and what kind of structures or what, and what movie has what, and things like that. So I definitely say to look into those. I'm not going to be going into those details myself because that will take a month. Um, but yeah, it's good to have your first start with your main character or your main mystery or whatever your central thread is. Figure out the basic idea of how you want that to go. So I, for example, looked at the first book that I wrote, and the first book I wrote, I didn't design anything. I just sort of wrote and went and saw what happened. Of course, by the time I wrote the first book in this series, I'd already written a number of novels before. I'd already done a lot of research into these things, so I sort of knew vaguely what I was doing. So by the time I got to the end of the book, I noticed that I had accidentally built a structure into the first book. And it was, I'll go into detail in a second, but it basically had this shape to it of they went to do this one thing, and then there was this surprise, and they went to do this other thing, and then it sort of leveled off. And I'm like, okay, I like that shape. So I decided that for my series of 12, I would try to follow that same shape for the overall series and sort of think of it like a fractal. And that seemed to work really well for me, because it's like, if you think of like the image of a tree, it's one trunk with branches, and then you look at a leaf and it's one thick piece with little veins, and it's like, okay, so this small piece looks like the big piece if you zoom out. And it's like that sort of idea will work for this too. So as I said, I'm not going to really be going into a lot of arcs, but this is a very basic arc design. So you start off with, at the beginning, you've got exposition. This is usually like, here's what the world is. And then something happens, the hero takes off, he fights a dragon, kills the dragon, becomes king, and goes home. Basic, basic story structure. There's a lot more information on these sorts of things on the internet. You've probably seen The Hero's Journey. I think Bethany mentioned it briefly. This is basically Star Wars, The Odyssey. Pretty much any boy becoming a man story really follows this structure. And for mine, I sort of came up with this as a basic idea for my first book. So it started off with my main character alone at home. And then almost immediately he took off on an adventure, and he got into trouble, and he met pirates, and he got confused, and everything got weird, and it got really exciting. And then something huge happened, and then there was a big surprise. And he found himself suddenly without the support structure he'd just built. His friends from the beginning of the book were gone. He was alone. And now he's got to do all of this by himself. And that was a big deal for him, because he was sort of riding on other characters' coattails before then. So then he started again. And his friends came back, but by now he's in a new mindset. He's in a mindset of, okay, since all that happened to me, now I know that I'm not just following other people. I'm going to do this for myself. So that was a bit of character growth there too. So here he's gearing up again for the second conflict in the story, which was a very big deal. And then, of course, happy endings and all that. They figured it out. and they ended up at rest again, but now things have changed. So it's at rest, but not exactly. It's kind of moved up gently. Now he has friends. He has made a few connections because that was the point of my series, and so it was a little bit of a progression. So I'm like, okay, well, this is useful. So once you've got your arc figured out, your central arc, now you can start adding other arcs, because the nice thing about a series is you have so much room that you don't have to just take one character through a journey. You can have every single side character have their own arc, or you can have like 3 or 4 side characters have their own arc. And that's actually much more fulfilling in a story, to have the side characters or the secondary main characters also go through trials of their own alongside the main character. So, but one thing that's very important is, again, remember who the point of this story is, or what the point of this story is, and try to make sure that the secondary arcs don't directly conflict with the main one. You want to make sure that they all sort of support each other. They don't have to be exactly the same idea, but you can't let them conflict. So, for example, if the point of the story is, like for mine, my character needed to find human connections, he can't run into someone whose ending idea is I don't need people, because that completely messes up the meaning of the book. So everybody he runs into, even if they think that they don't need people or they don't want connections or they think that way, they have to get over that by the end of the series, and they have to agree with him by the end. And that's actually what happened with the secondary main character in my series. Is Twist, the main, he was very isolated and had reasons to not really want to be a part of a group. But then there was another character who very violently didn't want to be with people because he was afraid of being hurt. And so the two of them both sort of learned to trust and learned to love, and they supported each other in that change, even though they had very different arcs. And also, if you're doing a series, it's perfectly fine to have almost an entire book be spotlight on a different character, because you've got so much room. As long as your main character is still around, they can just sort of watch for a while. It's totally fine. As long as there's some movement and some growth in the basic story, you're going to be fine. Your readers are going to be entertained. And also, the secondary arcs are a good way to explore minor details that you don't have time for in the main arc. If like the main arc, the way you design it, you're like, I wish I could mention this, but it doesn't fit with this character. He wouldn't do that. He doesn't have that kind of family member. Add in somebody else that can go through that part of the change. And it's totally fine to have that too. And I have some examples here. For example, in Star Wars, Han Solo isn't going from boy to man, but he's going from bad man to good man. So, and he's doing this right in front of Luke. So that his struggles to become a better person are kind of showing Luke how to become not just a man, but how to become a good man, and that sort of idea. And Aragorn in Lord of the Rings, he showed up mid-story already very damaged by his adventure, which sort of was a warning for Frodo. But Frodo, of course, keeps going and does all of his adventure. But it was a nice sort of, I thought that was a nice way to sort of go, this is what you're heading for. So that's some examples there as well. I've got a few more here, but I'm going to skip them for time. So anyway, step 7, it's time to start. So at this point, I would say if you've already kind of got an idea, you've got a basic arc, you've got your main characters, you've got at least most of a book already written, it's time to go. Just follow your map, follow your instincts, and just start writing. At that point, just don't worry about the details too much, just see where it wants to go. And that's the fun part. And so, so basically, at this point, it's more of an issue of sectioning off what you've got. So you've got a map, you've already started writing. After a while, it's probably a good idea to sort of figure out, okay, well, how much does each book cover in this series? And you can use your initial writing as a base, maybe make that the first book like I did. I personally, when it came to the series, I wrote from beginning to end with the initial draft of everything. I never wrote a scene over here and then came back and wrote a scene over here, because there's so much going on in my series. I would have gotten lost even with all my maps. So I would say when you're starting your writing situation, basically just go from beginning to end. You can always go back to edit. You can always go back and change that scene back there. If you're writing later on and you're like, oh crap, I need to change that. But try to do it linearly. It really helped me. If you need to, go ahead and skip ahead, but like keep really good notes. So at this point, you're going to be following your map. So if you have 2 books worth of time you've scheduled, and you've scheduled a big twist, keep track of where that's going to be in like word count. So like my first book was 85,000 words. So I figured, okay, I'm going to try to make everything about that. So if I had, I knew I wanted a big thing in the middle, then I would try to hold off and just build up a little bit more if I needed to push time or speed up, whatever, to try to make it sort of match. And also wait to add characters until they're needed for your central arc. Again, this is like all of the extra characters, all the extra settings are all supporting the main character and the main idea. So if you don't need somebody at the beginning of the story, add them in later. Just have them show up later. It's totally fine. You got plenty of room for these things. And also, you can send characters off if you want to. You can have them just sort of disappear for a whole book if they're not essential to the story you're telling at the time. So it's perfectly fine to have people come and go. And also, I did a lot of pre-writing for me, which was honestly just sitting down and thinking about it for like an hour alone in my room talking to myself. It works great. Or put some music on and just sort of think about it. And just sort of the more you do that, the more you, without actually writing, just sit down and think about your story, I think the better it gets, because your subconscious gets time to chew on it and to figure out what you're trying to say, really. So again, going back to the structuring. So this was the basic arc for my first book. And this ended up being the basic design for the entire series. So as I said, the first book sort of started low and ended a little bit more excited. They were at rest, but it's a little higher. And the second one did the same, and the third one did the same. And what I did was I tried for each book, they all followed this same structure. Internally, each one had a first conflict, a second conflict, and a resolution. And each time in the middle, there was some really big, like huge shift for the main characters or whoever had the spotlight. And so doing that, I sort of generally had this sort of like up motion for most of the books. So that helped to sort of escalate things. I tried to push it as we got to the third book and tried to be more like, for my books, I wanted them to be very adventurous. So I tried to be more exciting and more interesting. And I added more, like the best ideas I had sort of came up at this point. And then, book 4 was mostly conflict for the main character. And at the end, in book 5, by the time book 5 started, once again, the main mental landscape of the main character in 5 was, I have to do this by myself regardless of my friends. And he was on a completely different, he was doing something completely different at this point. It wasn't the original thing that had happened, but it was the same idea. And so doing that sort of brought him low, sort of took off some supports, made him deal with things by himself. That really made the character grow again. And so then I just continued with gearing up towards the second conflict in the series, and then the resolution and everything that happened in the ending. And that's all in the last book. So I was able to actually basically map the general feeling of all of the books onto this same basic structure. And it worked really well. I was very happy about that. So I think that if you're going to be doing the same thing, you probably can sort of fractalize your story arc into multiple books in this way by sort of cutting it and be like, okay, well, this whole book's just gearing up. So this is just going to be fun stuff. There's not going to be really big downs. There's going to be some downs, but it's mostly going to be learning and growing and having fun and having an adventure and all of that. and then kaboom. So basically that was the idea. So step 9, at this point, hopefully you've got most of your series is mapped out. You've probably got a few of the books written. Everything's good. So let's look at exposition, because it is a tricky beast. So if you're writing a very non-normal story, like sci-fi or high fantasy or something like that, something that's unusual to the reader that they don't know automatically, you're going to have to give a lot of exposition at the beginning to set things up. But if you have a very detailed plot, if you have a mystery, if what I had in mind was, as the story went along, more and more layers of complexity got built into what they were doing. So at the beginning, they didn't even know that anyone was after them. By the end, they're fighting their enemies. So it was like a whole thing. I very carefully sort of gave out my exposition as it was needed, and not before. So if you have to set up a world, you have to set up a world. But once you've done that, try not to give too much exposition at a time. Try to smooth it out. Try to give little dumps here and there, or add in characters that can explain it in a more interesting way. But it is extremely important that you know what's going on. So if you're writing, as happened to me, if you're writing and you're like, oh, that's a good idea, I'm going to add that in. Oh, that's a good idea, I'm going to add that in. And you're going on and you're writing and you're coming up with more and more ideas, that's totally fine. Just keep track of them. And it's very, very important that you understand what's going on with those ideas. So every time I came up with a big epiphany or some new idea that was a really big world-changing idea, I went back and stopped and looked at what I had and looked at what I was planning and made sure that it fit with the idea. It wasn't contradictory to the arc. It wasn't contradictory to the characters. And I carefully decided where I was going to start weaving this in. If you have to have exposition dumps, do it in a funny conversation. Do it in an action scene. Do it in a way that is more interesting to read than giving your characters a briefing, basically. And also, when in doubt, don't explain. If you think that something is important, it's important that you know what it is as a writer, but maybe your reader will infer it. Maybe your reader is smart enough to figure out what you're trying to say, and you don't always have to explain. This is where having beta readers and alpha readers is a real big help. But for me, after a while, I'm like, I'm just going to trust my readers to understand. And so far, no one has told me my books are confusing, so I should be okay. But yeah, people are usually pretty smart, especially if they're reading books. Oh, and also one thing, also like exposition, once you've got some stories written, you've got some books going, look back at your cast and make sure that you don't have any extra characters, because that is something that will definitely bog you down and slow you down and make things much harder to keep track of. So one thing you can do is, are there any 2 characters that are very alike? And I ended up having 2 characters that were very alike. And I realized this, but they had different placement in the story. They had different reasons for being the way they were. And I decided, okay, I'm just not going to ever let these 2 people meet. And so they never really did. They were in the same scene like 2 or 3 times, and they never had a conversation. So I was able to sort of skip that. But yeah, if you have 2 characters that are alike, see if you can combine them. Maybe your character doesn't need a brother. Maybe your character, needs just one extra friend, that kind of thing. Try to figure out if you can sort of fix that by sort of just basically try to trim. Because the less characters you have, the stronger they can be, is really the truth of it. And if your character hasn't been in the series for a while, like I did frequently, a lot of my side characters came and went. If they're a really strong character, your reader's not going to have trouble remembering who they are. But it's always fine to add in a little, oh, I haven't seen you since wherever, sort of line or 2 to remind your reader quickly what's going on without having to completely reintroduce them. So now at this point, hopefully you've got most of your series written when you're dealing with tone and escalation. So I touched on escalation a little bit before, but basically, what I did for tone is like, is your story tense? Is it happy? Is it relaxed? Is it, exciting? Is it adventurous? Is it a romance? This sort of ideas. I wanted to make sure that all of the books had the same basic tone, because I wanted the escalation of events to carry everything else. So for that, to make sure that my tone stayed consistent as I was writing, when I got to like book 6 and 7 and 8, I went back and reread 2 and 3 or 1 and just sort of read them without really editing, just to sort of remind myself of how I was writing, to try to make sure that the tone stayed consistent. For me, that was something important. You can also, if you wanted, change the tone slowly over time. That's totally fine. It's just not what I decided to do. And also, your writing ability is going to improve as you write a series. Just mathematically, the more time you spend writing, the better you're going to be at it. So by the end of my series, I had learned so many clever tricks that I started to worry that the skill level and the voice I was using would change. So I went back and I boosted up the first book, fixed things, trimmed it, made it better, and then, sort of gently did that with the rest of them and tried to dummy down my writing for the last ones, because I wanted it to have that bingeable sort of single level of skill and voice, and I wanted the tone to be the same. So that's something to be careful of when you're doing a series. And for escalation, I would definitely follow your arcs. For me, I wanted to make sure that every time a book ended, even though they were at rest at the end of the book, I wanted things to have changed. They've got new friends, they've got new problems, but now they can relax for a second. Yeah, and if you need to, you can adjust your arcs to feel better, to make the tone work better. It's okay. Just it's really important to know what you're doing when you start. And so getting on to 12, so when you're about 3/4 of the way through your series, I think that's a good time to stop and read everything one more time. Just like stop writing, go back to book 1 and read from beginning to end, just to sort of let your brain digest what you've done, what's happened, make notes of anything you want to change, make sure that the arcs you've designed are getting tied up as you intended. Did you forget about anybody? So I think 3/4 of the way through is a really good time to just hard stop, take a breath, and reread what you've already done. And also make sure that your ending is still the ending you want to have, because maybe you've written yourself into a different design and you've written into a different angle, and that is okay as long as you know what you're doing. So if you recognize that you've changed what you want and the first ending you came up with months ago or years ago isn't working anymore, well, it's okay to change it now. 3/4 of the way, you've got time. You can go back and you can edit the first ones, rearrange things so that it's headed towards this new ending that you like better, and you can redesign what ending you want before you get there. So I think this is a good time. For me, I ended up rewriting book 7, I think like 4 times when I was working on my series, because that was really the tipping point for a lot of things, and I wanted to make sure it was perfect so that it would be a foundation for the later books. And so once now we're at step 13. Okay, you've checked everything, you've written your whole series, and it's finally done. Oh my God. And so at this point, hopefully you've gotten through the ending that you designed, whatever point you designed it in. Hopefully that is all finished. You've gotten to the end, everything's organized, all the arcs are done. Oh, fantastic. So now, once again, like you did at 3/4 through, read from the beginning all the way through. And again, at this point, it's going to be fun to reread it because it's going to be nostalgic to reread those first books. And it'll also, like, as you go through it one last time, you can definitely make sure that all of your arcs are going to be leading towards that ending. And that is what gives you a really satisfying ending, is having that, everything pointing in that direction, all the subconscious little tricks, all of the character arcs that aren't your main character, all of that pointing there. That's what gives it that really nice conclusion feeling. And so, I enjoyed that part best. Okay, so that's pretty much what I wanted to tell you.
Well, there we are. What an amazing session with Emily Thompson. I apologise for the abrupt ending to our to Emily's presentation, but that seemed the best place to stop when I was listening to the replay. So I hope you got a lot from that. There is a lot there, but if you are writing a series, you will definitely get a lot of benefit from that. And as I mentioned at the beginning, if you go to the show notes at the podcast, Turning Readers into Writers, you will get the link there to get access to those slides, and I think you can even download them from her blog. All right, take care for now, and I will see you next time. Well, thank you so much for joining me today. I hope you found that helpful and inspirational. Now, don't forget to come on over to Facebook and join my group, Turning Readers into Writers. It is especially for you if you are a beginner writer who is looking to write their first novel. If you join the group, you will also find a free cheat sheet there called 3 Secret Hacks to Write with Consistency. So go to emmadesi.com/turning readers into writers, hit join. Can't wait to see you in there. All right. Thank you. Bye-bye.